Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're stepping into one of Padre Pio's most chilling and revealing visions. A story about deception so complete, so carefully crafted, that even those closest to the truth never suspected what lay beneath the surface. If you've been following these stories, you already know that Padre Pio saw beyond the masks people wore. He witnessed souls in their truest form, stripped of pretense and illusion. But this particular encounter shook him more deeply than most. It was the vision of a woman who appeared to live a life of perfect devotion, yet harbored secrets that would ultimately seal her eternal fate. For Padre Pio, the spiritual world was never hidden. He saw through the carefully constructed facades that people built around themselves. He witnessed the battles between light and darkness that raged within human hearts. But among all the souls he encountered, few disturbed him as profoundly as this one. A woman whose public holiness masked a private corruption so complete that even heaven itself seemed to weep at her choices. The vision came to him during one of his long nights of prayer in the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo. It was past midnight, and the chapel was bathed in the soft glow of sanctuary lamps. Padre Pio had been kneeling before the tabernacle for hours, his rosary moving slowly through weathered fingers. The silence was so complete that even his breathing seemed to echo in the sacred space. Then, without warning, a coldness swept through the chapel. Not the natural chill of winter air, but something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from the very shadows themselves. He lifted his eyes and saw her standing near the altar rail. At first glance, she appeared exactly as she had in life. A woman in her middle years, dressed modestly, with hands folded in what looked like prayer. Her face carried the serene expression of someone accustomed to devotion, someone who had spent countless hours in meditation and worship. Everything about her appearance suggested a soul at peace, a faithful servant who had lived according to God's will. But Padre Pio immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The woman's serenity felt hollow, like a beautiful mask hiding something grotesque beneath. Her folded hands trembled slightly, not with reverence, but with barely contained anguish. And her eyes, when she finally looked at him, held a darkness that no amount of outward piety could conceal. She spoke first, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she had used in life when addressing fellow parishioners or offering comfort to those in need. She told Padre Pio how she had been known in her community as a woman of exceptional faith. She had attended daily mass without fail for over 20 years. She had organized charity drives for the poor and spent countless hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. Her spiritual director had often held her up as an example to other souls seeking deeper devotion. As she recounted these details, Padre Pio felt a growing unease. He had seen many souls from purgatory, and they typically appeared with visible signs of their purification. They carried the weight of their earthly failures, but also the hope of eventual redemption. This woman, however, emanated something different entirely. There was no hope in her presence, no sense of movement toward the light. Instead, she seemed frozen in a state of terrible recognition, as if she had finally seen herself as she truly was, and could not bear the sight. The woman continued her account, describing how others had sought her spiritual counsel. Young mothers had come to her for advice about raising their children in faith. Struggling souls had confided their deepest fears and doubts, trusting in her apparent wisdom and holiness. Parish priests had relied on her organizational skills and had often praised her dedication to the church. To everyone who knew her, she had been a living saint, a woman whose very presence seemed to bring others closer to God. But then her voice began to change. The gentle tone cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. She told Padre Pio that her entire spiritual life had been a performance, a carefully orchestrated deception that she had maintained for decades. Every act of charity had been calculated to enhance her reputation. Every hour spent in apparent prayer had been used to plan her next manipulation or to savor the praise she received from others. Her devotion had never been directed toward God, but toward the image she had created of herself. Padre Pio listened in growing horror as she revealed the true nature of her secret life. Behind closed doors, away from the admiring eyes of her community, she had lived according to entirely different principles. She had harbored deep resentments against those she considered less spiritual than herself. She had spread subtle gossip about fellow parishioners, always couched in terms of concern for their spiritual welfare. She had manipulated situations to ensure that she remained at the center of the parish's spiritual activities, not out of love for God, but out of pride and a hunger for recognition. But her deceptions ran even deeper than spiritual vanity. The woman confessed to Padre Pio that she had engaged in acts that completely contradicted everything she publicly professed. While counseling young wives about the sanctity of marriage, she had been conducting secret affairs. While organizing charity for the poor, she had been embezzling funds for her own comfort. While appearing to fast and do penance, she had been indulging in every form of excess when no one was watching. The most chilling aspect of her confession was not the sins themselves, but the calculated nature of her deception. She had not stumbled into these behaviors out of weakness or momentary temptation. Instead, she had deliberately constructed a false identity that allowed her to satisfy her desires while maintaining her reputation for holiness. She had used people's trust in her apparent sanctity as a shield to hide her true nature. As she spoke, Padre Pio began to understand the full scope of the tragedy before him. This was not simply a case of human weakness or even serious sin. This was a soul that had systematically rejected grace while appearing to embrace it. She had turned the very instruments of salvation into tools of deception. Her prayers had become lies, her acts of charity had become theft, and her spiritual counseling had become manipulation. The woman's voice grew more desperate as she continued her account. She told Padre Pio about the moments when grace had tried to reach her, when her conscience had whispered warnings about the path she was choosing. But each time, she had silenced these promptings, convincing herself that her public image was more important than private truth. She had become so skilled at deception that she had begun to deceive herself, almost believing in the holiness she projected while simultaneously planning her next act of secret corruption. Padre Pio felt his heart breaking as he listened to this account. He had seen souls struggling with sin, souls burdened by guilt, and souls slowly climbing toward redemption through the fires of purgatory. But this woman represented something far more tragic. She had not simply fallen into sin and then sought forgiveness. She had weaponized faith itself, turning it into an instrument of personal gratification rather than genuine conversion. The most devastating moment came when she described her final days on earth. Even as she lay dying, surrounded by fellow parishioners who spoke of her as a saint, she had maintained her facade. People had begged for her prayers, believing that her intercession would carry special weight with God. They had kissed her hands and asked for her blessing, never suspecting that those same hands had been instruments of theft and adultery. Terry. She had accepted their reverence with a smile that she knew was built on lies, all while planning how she would continue her deceptions if she recovered. Even in those final moments, she had been calculating, wondering if she could use her illness to garner even more sympathy and admiration from her community. But death, Padre Pio realized as he listened, had stripped away all possibility of continued pretense. In that instant, when her soul left her body, she had been forced to confront the truth she had spent decades avoiding. All the carefully constructed lies, all the manipulated perceptions, all the stolen trust had suddenly become meaningless. She stood naked before divine justice, with nowhere left to hide. The woman's demeanor shifted as she described that moment of reckoning. Her false serenity completely crumbled, replaced by a terror so profound that Padre Pio could feel it radiating from her like heat from a fire. She told him that the most agonizing part was not God's judgment, but her own recognition of what she had become. She had spent so many years crafting her false image that she had forgotten there was ever any truth beneath it. When the light of divine truth had shone upon her soul, she had seen herself clearly for the first time in decades. Every act of charity revealed as selfish ambition, every prayer exposed as empty performance, every moment of supposed spiritual counseling shown to be manipulation and control. The weight of all these revelations had crashed down on her simultaneously, and she had understood with crushing clarity that she had never actually sought God at all. Padre Pio watched as the woman's composure completely dissolved. She began to weep, But these were not the tears of repentance that he had seen from souls in purgatory. These were tears of rage and despair, the bitter crying of someone who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. She was not sorry for her sins so much as she was furious at being caught, angry that her carefully maintained deception had finally been exposed. She told him that what tormented her most was the memory of all the souls she had led astray. Young women had looked to her as an example of holy living, never knowing that their role model was secretly living a life of complete moral corruption. Men struggling with temptation had sought her counsel, trusting in her apparent purity, while she harbored desires far darker than their own. Children had been taught to respect and emulate her, absorbing lessons about faith from someone who had no genuine faith to offer. The ripple effects of her deception, she realized, had spread far beyond her own soul. She had poisoned the spiritual lives of countless others, not through open rebellion against God, but through the far more insidious method of false example. People had measured their own spiritual progress against her apparent holiness, often becoming discouraged when they could not match what they thought was her level of devotion. They never knew that what they were trying to imitate was completely fabricated. Padre Pio listened with growing anguish as she described the moment when divine justice had shown her the full extent of her spiritual damage. She had seen the souls of people who had been hurt by her manipulations, who had lost faith because of her hypocritical example, who had become cynical about religious devotion after eventually discovering hints of her true nature. Each wounded soul had felt like another weight pressing down on her own spirit. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her account was what happened next. As the full truth of her life became clear, she had been given one final opportunity for genuine repentance. The mercy of God, Padre Pio understood, extends even to the most calculated sinners. Even in that moment of complete exposure, she could have thrown herself on divine mercy, could have finally chosen truth over deception, humility over pride. Instead, she had chosen defiance. Faced with the complete collapse of her false identity, she had not embraced the truth, but had rejected it entirely. She had looked at the light of God's mercy and turned away, preferring the darkness she had created to the authentic conversion that was still being offered. In that final moment, she had chosen to remain loyal to her lies rather than surrender to truth. The woman's voice grew cold as she described this ultimate rejection. She told Padre Pio that she had realized in that moment that genuine repentance would require her to acknowledge that her entire adult life had been a waste, that all the admiration she had received had been based on falsehood, that she was not the spiritual giant she had pretended to be, but was actually among the most spiritually impoverished souls imaginable. That acknowledgement, she said, had felt impossible. To accept God's mercy would have meant accepting that she was exactly the kind of person she had always looked down upon. It would have meant admitting that her victims were actually more honest than she was, more spiritually advanced in their acknowledged struggles than she was in her secret corruption. Her pride, which had driven her deceptions for so long, made it impossible for her to embrace the humility that true conversion required. So she had chosen separation instead of salvation, isolation instead of integration, the cold comfort of her lies instead of the warm truth of divine love. She had walked away from the light, not because it was too harsh, but because it required her to become someone completely different from the person she had spent decades creating. Padre Pio felt the temperature in the chapel drop even further as she finished this part of her account. He realized he was witnessing something that filled him with deeper horror than any of the demonic encounters he had experienced. This was not a soul being dragged unwillingly toward damnation, but a soul choosing it deliberately, preferring eternal isolation to the vulnerability that forgiveness required. The woman looked at Padre Pio with eyes that held no hope, no longing for rescue, no desire for intercession. She had come to him not to seek help, but to bear witness to her choice, to ensure that someone understood the full scope of what spiritual deception could accomplish. She wanted him to know that damnation was not always the result of passionate rebellion or dramatic sin, but could come through the quiet, methodical rejection of truth over many years. She told him that her torment was not fire or physical pain, but the eternal awareness of what she had chosen to become. She was trapped forever in the lie she had created, unable to escape the false self that had consumed her authentic identity. She could see truth clearly now, but could no longer choose it. She could recognize love, but could no longer receive it. She understood mercy, but had made herself incapable of accepting it. Incapable of accepting it. The woman's final words to Padre Pio carried a weight that pressed down on his soul like a stone. She told him that the greatest tragedy was not her damnation itself, but the fact that she had chosen it so deliberately, so methodically, with such complete understanding of what she was rejecting. She had not fallen into darkness through ignorance or overwhelming temptation. She had walked into it with her eyes wide open, preferring the familiar comfort of her deceptions to the terrifying honesty that salvation demanded. As she spoke these words, Padre Pio noticed that the shadows around her seemed to deepen and solidify. What had begun as a conversation was becoming something far more ominous. The woman's form was starting to fade, not gradually dissolving like the souls from purgatory he had encountered, but being absorbed into the darkness that surrounded her. She was returning to the realm she had chosen, the eternal isolation she had preferred to divine communion. But before she vanished entirely, she delivered one final message that would haunt Padre Pio for the rest of his life. She told him that her story was not unique, that there were many others like her scattered throughout the world. Souls who had learned to weaponize faith, who had turned devotion into a mask for corruption, who had discovered that the appearance of holiness could be more profitable than holiness itself. She warned him that these false saints were perhaps the most dangerous souls alive, because they did not simply harm themselves through their deceptions. They poisoned the faith of everyone around them. When their true nature was eventually discovered, as it sometimes was, it left entire communities questioning whether any spiritual devotion could be trusted. Young people lost faith, not because they encountered obvious evil, but because they saw apparent good revealed as calculated deception. The woman's voice grew fainter as she told Padre Pio that the devil's greatest victory was not in creating obvious sinners, but in creating false saints. Murderers and thieves, she said, at least wore their darkness openly. People could see them coming and guard themselves accordingly. But souls like her infiltrated the very heart of religious communities, using trust and reverence as weapons against the innocent. She described how easy it had been to maintain her deception for so many years. Religious communities, she explained, were naturally inclined to think the best of people who appeared devout. They wanted to believe in genuine holiness, so they overlooked small inconsistencies and explained away minor contradictions. Their very goodness had made them vulnerable to her calculated exploitation. The most chilling part of her revelation was how she had used confession itself as a tool of manipulation. She had learned to confess minor, invented sins to maintain the appearance of humility while never acknowledging her real corruptions. She had even used the confessional to gather information about other parishioners, pretending to seek counsel about how to help them while actually looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit. Her spiritual director, she revealed, had never suspected anything because she had become expert at telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. She had studied his personality, his particular spiritual emphases, his pet concerns, and had crafted her confessions accordingly. She had presented herself as the ideal penitent, always growing, always responding to guidance, always grateful for correction that she never actually implemented. Padre Pio listened with mounting horror as she described how she had corrupted even the most sacred aspects of faith. She had used her reputation for holiness to gain access to families in crisis, positioning herself as a spiritual counselor while actually gathering information for gossip or identifying opportunities for financial manipulation. She had volunteered to help with church finances specifically because her apparent devotion made people trust her with money they would never have entrusted to someone with an obviously worldly demeanor. The woman told him that her secret sins had become more elaborate and daring as the years passed, precisely because her public reputation provided such perfect cover. She had discovered that the holier she appeared, the less likely people were to question her behavior. She had used prayer meetings as opportunities to identify lonely or vulnerable individuals she could manipulate. She had used her position organizing charitable activities to embezzle funds, while ensuring that enough good work was done to maintain the organization's reputation. Most devastatingly, she had used her role as a spiritual mentor to young women to normalize behaviors that served her own interests. She had gradually introduced ideas that made her charges more compliant, more willing to overlook inconsistencies, more dependent on her guidance. She had created a network of devoted followers who competed for her approval and defended her against any criticism, never realizing they were enabling corruption rather than supporting sanctity. As her form continued to fade, the woman delivered her most urgent warning. She told Padre Pio that souls like hers were particularly dangerous during times of religious revival or spiritual awakening. When people were hungry for authentic holiness, they became even more susceptible to false examples. They were so eager to find genuine saints that they lowered their spiritual discernment, accepting appearances at face value rather than looking more deeply into the fruits of apparent devotion. She explained that false saints often emerged during periods when true saints were also active, because the contrast made their deceptions more believable. They studied the behavior and language of authentic holy people and learned to mimic their external characteristics while remaining completely unchanged internally. They became spiritual parasites, feeding off the genuine spiritual hunger of others, while providing nothing but empty performance in return. The woman's voice became barely audible as she described the moment she had realized her eternal fate was sealed. It had not come through any external pronouncement or dramatic revelation. Instead, she had simply understood with perfect clarity that she had spent so many years rejecting truth that she no longer possessed the capacity to choose it. Her freedom itself had been corrupted by decades of deliberate deception until she could no longer distinguish between authentic desire for God and manipulative performance. She told Padre Pio that the most agonizing aspect of her damnation was not punishment but awareness. She could see clearly now all the opportunities for genuine conversion that she had rejected, all the moments when authentic grace had been offered, and she had chosen calculation instead. She could recognize the beauty of true holiness in others and understand exactly what she had forfeited, but she could no longer reach toward it. The final image she left with Padre Pio was perhaps the most disturbing of all. She showed him a vision of herself as she had appeared during her last confession before death. She had knelt in the confessional, presenting the same carefully crafted facade she had maintained for decades, receiving absolution for sins she had not actually confessed while planning new deceptions, even as the priest spoke the words of forgiveness. Even in that sacred moment, she had been more concerned with maintaining her image than with the state of her soul. As the woman's presence finally dissolved completely into the surrounding darkness, Padre Pio found himself alone in the chapel, but the silence felt different now. It was not the peaceful quiet of sacred space, but the heavy stillness that follows a revelation too terrible to fully comprehend. He remained kneeling for hours afterward, praying desperately for all the souls who might be walking the same path of self-deception, all the communities that might be harboring false saints, all the innocent people who might be trusting in spiritual guidance that was actually spiritual poison. The encounter left Padre Pio with a new understanding of the subtlety of evil and the terrible vulnerability of human goodness. He realized that the most dangerous spiritual threats often came not from obvious corruption, but from corrupted virtue, not from open rebellion, but from false submission, not from the absence of religion, but from religion twisted into an instrument of personal gratification rather than genuine conversion. In the days that followed, Padre Pio found himself scrutinizing his own motivations with unprecedented intensity. The woman's story had shown him how easily spiritual practices could become spiritual theater, how naturally the desire for holiness could be corrupted into the desire for a reputation for holiness. He began to question every act of devotion, every moment of prayer, every gesture of charity, asking himself whether he was seeking God or seeking the approval that came from appearing to seek God. This experience transformed how Padre Pio approached his ministry of confession and spiritual direction. He became far more discerning, not in a harsh or suspicious way, but with the careful attention of someone who had seen how perfectly deception could masquerade as devotion. He learned to listen not just to what penitents said, but to what they avoided saying. He began to notice the subtle signs of spiritual performance versus genuine spiritual struggle. The woman's revelation had shown him that the most convincing religious facades were often built by those who understood authentic spirituality well enough to counterfeit it perfectly. They knew exactly what holy people were supposed to say, how they were supposed to act, what concerns they were supposed to express. They had studied sanctity like actors studying a role, learning to deliver the performance so convincingly that even experienced spiritual directors could be fooled. Padre Pio began to teach that the greatest protection against spiritual deception was not suspicion, but deeper prayer. He urged people to ask God for the grace to see beyond appearances, to discern the true fruits of holiness rather than its external manifestations. He reminded them that authentic saints were often marked more by their humility about their own spiritual progress than by confidence in their spiritual achievements. He also began to emphasize the importance of examining one's own motivations regularly and ruthlessly. The woman's story had demonstrated how gradually and imperceptibly the desire for God could be replaced by the desire for recognition, without the person even realizing the substitution had occurred. She had not begun her spiritual life intending to become a fraud. The deception had grown slowly, fed by small compromises and tiny acts of spiritual vanity, until it consumed her entirely. In his letters to spiritual children, Padre Pio wrote extensively about the danger of spiritual pride disguised as spiritual devotion. He explained that the moment someone began to take credit for their spiritual progress, to compare themselves favorably to other souls, or to seek recognition for their religious practices, they had already begun walking the path that had led the woman to her eternal fate. He taught that genuine holiness was marked by an increasing awareness of one's own spiritual poverty, not by confidence in one's spiritual wealth. True saints, he insisted, were those who became more conscious of their need for mercy as they grew closer to God, not those who felt increasingly secure in their righteousness. The woman had exemplified the opposite trajectory, becoming more certain of her spiritual superiority, even as she grew more corrupt. The vision also revealed to Padre Pio the particular vulnerability of religious communities to this form of spiritual poison. He saw how the very virtues that made communities healthy, their trust in apparent goodness, their desire to think well of their members, their reluctance to judge, could be weaponized by those who understood how to exploit religious sentiment for personal gain. He began to counsel religious leaders about the importance of looking for consistency between public devotion and private behavior, not through spying or suspicion, but through the patient observation that comes from genuine pastoral care. He taught them to be especially wary of those who seemed too perfect, whose spiritual progress appeared too smooth, whose devotion never seemed to struggle with genuine human weakness. The woman's confession had revealed that authentic spiritual growth was almost always marked by periods of difficulty, doubt, and honest acknowledgement of failure. Those who claimed never to experience spiritual dryness, never to struggle with temptation, never to question their own motivations, were often the most dangerous members of any religious community because they were either lying to others or lying to themselves. Padre Pio also recognized a particular responsibility toward those who sought him out for spiritual guidance. The woman's story had shown him how spiritual directors could unknowingly enable deception by accepting appearances at face value, by being too eager to celebrate apparent spiritual progress, by failing to probe beneath surface presentations of devotion. He developed a practice of asking penitents not just about their sins, but about their spiritual struggles, their moments of doubt, their experiences of God's absence as well as God's presence. He learned that those who could speak honestly about their spiritual difficulties were often more advanced than those who claimed constant spiritual consolation. The encounter had also revealed to him the terrible responsibility carried by those who presented themselves as spiritual guides. The woman had caused immeasurable damage, not just through her personal corruptions, but through the false example she had provided to others. Young souls had modeled their spiritual lives on her deceptions, learning to value appearance over substance, performance over authenticity. Padre Pio began to speak more frequently about the special judgment that awaited those who led others astray through false spiritual teaching or example. He explained that God's mercy was infinite, but those who corrupted the faith of others carried a weight of responsibility that made their path to redemption far more difficult. They had not simply harmed themselves, but had poisoned the spiritual wells from which others drank. In his homilies, he began to address the congregation's responsibility to discern authentic holiness from counterfeit spirituality. He taught them that true saints were recognizable not by their claims to spiritual achievement, but by their genuine love for those around them, especially those who could do nothing for them in return. False saints, he explained, typically showed special attention to those who could enhance their reputation, while subtly neglecting or looking down on those who offered no social advantage. The woman's story had also revealed the particular danger of using religious language and concepts to justify essentially selfish behavior. She had learned to frame her manipulations as spiritual concern, her embezzlement as prudent stewardship, her affairs as pastoral care for lonely souls. She had corrupted the very vocabulary of faith, turning words meant to describe divine love into tools for personal gratification. Padre Pio warned his spiritual children to be especially wary when religious justifications were offered for behaviors that seemed to serve primarily personal interests. He taught them that authentic spiritual guidance almost always pointed toward greater sacrifice and service, not toward greater comfort or recognition for the person offering the guidance. For Padre Pio, this vision remained one of his most sobering encounters with the eternal consequences of spiritual deception. The woman's fate served as a stark reminder that the greatest danger to the soul often comes not from obvious sin, but from pride disguised as piety. Her story became a warning he carried for the rest of his life, a testament to how easily the pursuit of holiness can become the pursuit of a reputation for holiness, and how that subtle shift can lead to eternal separation from the very God one claims to serve.